but actually our data are actually expressions of our, in a sense, our life force, right? Like our data are what are being, spat out about us at all places and all times, essentially. Even if it's not on our phones, it's being triangulated on other systems. So we have to kind of think about data as an expression of ourselves as human beings, and how do we kind of understand that, and B, protect that as a right. I think that's something I'm trying to work on with multiple members of Congress. Kind of conceptualizing data as a right.
This week on Forward, UCLA professor and author of Beyond the Valley, one of the experts on tech's impact on us and our lives, Ramesh Srinivasan. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Forward podcast, author of Beyond the Valley, UCLA professor, surrogate for Bernie and Joe and Kamala. I don't know how we pulled that one off. One of the foremost experts on technology's impact on our society, Ramesh Srinivasan. Welcome, Ramesh.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me. I'm psyched to join Forward.
Yeah, we're psyched to have you. So, tell us a little bit about how the heck you came to be one of the world's leading authorities on technology's impact. You, came up as a student. You got your PhD. Like, when did you become passionate about this?
So I studied engineering at Stanford in the late 1990s, right? We remember that time. We're around the same age, Andrew, and in the late 1990s, as some of us may remember, there was a lot of buzz within Silicon Valley, and Stanford was very much like a hub.
Do you know any of the famous people then who were your classmates around then? Was like Jerry Yang down the hall and stuff like that?
Some of the PayPal founders were my classmates. Definitely people who were early at Google, Facebook, etc., were classmates of mine. We were all in Terman Hall in the engineering school together, and Andrew was actually, when I entered college, was quite interested in philosophy, religious studies, and art. Having first generation Indian American parents, they told me, look, like, that's all great, we love that stuff too, but major in engineering or science or medicine, so you can make sure that you'll have a job after college. So
that sounds familiar, Ramesh. I feel like maybe your parents and my parents are speaking from the same book. So you went to Stanford as an undergrad. Where did you grow up? Also in California?
Right in the Bay Area. I went to the same high school as Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Homestead High School, right near Stanford. My dad was a faculty member at Stanford. I almost went out to the East Coast. I was really attracted by liberal arts colleges. I almost went to Brown, except my dad said that we don't want you to go to Brown because they don't give letter grades there. I don't know if that's true or not to this day.
It can be true if you want it to be. that is a true fact about Brown. So, not to make it seem like you and I were counterparts, but I was choosing between Stanford and Brown and would have gone to Stanford if my brother had not chosen to transfer back east from Berkeley at the same time. So I sometimes think about the path not traveled, where if I had gone to Stanford in the mid-90s, would I have become tied up in the internet boom of the next number of years? Probably not, because like you, I was interested in philosophy and writing. I started out as an English major as one thing. I switched off pretty quick from that after I read like Mole Flanders or something. I was like, this is not what I need to be studying. So I switched to economics. But it's possible I would have been caught up in the internet boom that transpired. Whereas you were an engineering student, so you were in the thick of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was applied math and industrial engineering, and then I worked in machine learning and AI. But the entire time, Andrew, like, I was taking classes in the social sciences, both quantitative, like social network analysis, as well as, anthropology, philosophy, art, history, literature courses, because, and I'm so glad I took those classes. I'm so glad I'm still kind of the way I was back then in a lot of ways. because I was really interested. Ultimately, my interests are always in humanity, in our species and our planet, and that's something I actually have always cared about way more than anything technological. Obviously, technological interests or literacies in technology are critical to understanding our life chances as human beings at this point in time, right? So on every single level, I feel super grateful that I kind of came up in that world somewhat accidentally. I'm very, very familiar with the tendencies of people within Silicon Valley, the ways a lot of engineers function. I also went to MIT Media Lab for grad school. So I saw this firsthand. And I always saw a profound disconnection between, and it's partly our educational system, between the world of engineering and the worlds that our engineering were going to impact. And that's partly because, again, as engineers, we weren't really trained to think deeply about, political questions, social questions, cultural questions, economic questions, definitely not global questions.
Wow, you've really got the programming down pat. So again, I'll share this with you, where a lot of people know this about me. So my father and mother met as graduate students at UC Berkeley. My father got his PhD in physics, and generated 69 U.S. patents. My mom
Wow.
got a master's in math and statistics. So I grew up very, very geeky and nerdy around folks that I thought everyone did something in a lab as a job, stuff like that. And in my case, I went to high school and college in New England and studied economics and political science and philosophy and American civilization and a bunch of other things that I just found interesting. And then I went to law school, which is its own kind of coding and programming. And then I was a lawyer very, very briefly, and then left and then did a bunch of different things. But what's interesting is that I feel like my multidisciplinary approach is that, like, I feel like I get what ordinary people are experiencing, maybe to a slightly higher degree than like some other folks who've had similar rearing. But I have kind of like a structured thinking, engineering mindset to the problems that we have. So when I wrote my book, The War on Normal People, it was like, okay, AI automation, it's coming, it's going to get it. But my big challenge in many ways, Ramesh, and I think you can relate to this struggle in many ways, was that I had read books by technologists like Martin Ford and
Right.
Eric Brynjolfsson and whatnot, who'd written very effective books, Rise of the Robots and the Second Machine Age. And I thought, okay, my value add is going to be that I'm going to translate these things that they're talking about to what's going to happen to ordinary people.
Wow.
And so I remember talking to my editor, and he's like, "What's the name of this book going to be?" And I said, "The War on Normal People." And then, well, I like it. It's provocative. It's sensationalist. So I feel like you're similar in that you understand the engineering brain down pat. I mean, you have it, you grew up among it, you got the degrees and credentials, and yet you still have this kind of humanist impulse where you're trying to bridge the world of technology and what it's going to mean for ordinary real life humans. Is that fair to say?
I'm absolutely a humanist on every level. I believe deeply in that we should be starting and with the question of how do we want to live as human beings? How do we want to live as Americans? What kind of world do we want to live in? That's the question that should guide everything, whether it's technological, scientific, or otherwise, right? And that love of people and our planet, which I really have, it's a really like personal, emotional, almost spiritual kind of thing for me, came because I've traveled all over the world. I worked in AI in Amsterdam. I've worked in over 30 countries, Andrew. I've worked with a range of different kinds of communities in this country. I've worked with immigrants, with refugees, with Native Americans, on so many different levels. And so I would say my skills are far less as an engineer, though I do know how that mind works, and more as someone who can work with people, understand what they wish, what they want, and build with them, right? And so I would like to introduce that vision into where we go with this digital revolution. You had more sophistication than anyone else I saw in the 2020 campaign in discussing these dynamics and these issues. I was trying to bring some of that, honestly, into the Sanders campaign because I knew he was all about, the right the right things, the right values. I mean, I trusted him so much. And honestly, it's time for us to ask these big questions and make decisions in the collective interest rather than calling this out or that out, right? This, as you kind of are with with the forward party. It's time to move forward and make decisions together that are critical about the future of data, the future of AI, the future of surveillance and kind of data privacy issues. Where do we want to take this digital world? Because the digital world, as we know all too well, as you know all too well, is not simply about using social media or an exceptionalized example like Facebook. The digital world is in everything. When we get bank loans, we go to the hospital, the police department, the criminal justice system, or the lack thereof, in my opinion, they are all mediated by technology, data, and technology. So any decision about our collective future is partly a question about technology and where we want to take it.
Here at Forward, we think that your data should be yours, and that includes when you surf the web. I know you've noticed not just one company's tracking you, but 5, 6, 7 are tracking you, and incognito mode doesn't quite work the way that you hope it will. So how do you actually make yourself as invisible as possible online? You can use ExpressVPN like I do, because ExpressVPN allows you to beam in and get connected and rerouted through an encrypted server. Your IP address is masked. No one can track you. There's no record. Every time you connect to ExpressVPN, you get a random IP address shared by many other ExpressVPN customers. I know, it's almost too good to be true. Best of all, ExpressVPN is super easy to use. It's like you just beam into another computer. You even sometimes get access to content that other people have and you don't. If you really want to go incognito and protect your privacy, secure yourself with the #1 rated VPN. That's visit expressvpn.com/yang and get 3 extra months for free. That's expressvpn.com/yang. Go to expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. So you've worked all around the world and the country with different communities. You've been studying these problems for the last number of years. What has been the focus of your research at UCLA this last number of years?
Well, a few different issues. So first of all, I'm very interested in digital rights, right? So recognizing that in a sense, our data is not merely a piece of property or a commodity like my colleague Shoshana Zuboff writes about, but actually our data are actually expressions of our, in a sense, our life force, right? Like our data are what are being, spat out about us at all places and all times, essentially. Even if it's not on our phones, it's being triangulated on other systems. So we have to kind of think about data as an expression of ourselves as human beings, and how do we kind of understand that, and B, protect that as a right. I think that's something I'm trying to work on with multiple members of Congress, kind of conceptualizing data as a right. Secondly, I tend to work quite a bit on thinking about how we might design and think about technology in relation to different kinds of communities in our country and in our world, recognizing that many different communities have different sorts of needs and values and belief systems. And we have to think about how we design things like the rollout of internet networks, mobile networks, but even platforms in that way. Third real issue that I'm really focused on, and I have been for over a decade, is the relationship between digital technologies and various forms of peoples-based democracy, right? I know this is something that you've been kind of talking a lot about. So I, 10 years ago, was in the middle of Tahrir Square. I don't know if I told you about this yet. I was writing for Al Jazeera. I was there for 3 years, 3 summers, writing about the relationship between social movements and social networks and digital technology. And then the last thing, and I think this is actually probably the biggest spillover of our digitally mediated world and economy, is the effect on economics, right? And this is something we talked about before, Andrew. 25 million jobs in the digital vein that are going to be created within the next 5 to 10 years. Gig economy work seems more precarious than ever. I have students at UCLA, one of the top universities in our country, who are in massive amounts of student debt and are driving for Uber, working for Postmates. These are huge issues, right? Like, how do we deal with, this kind of unequal economy that is being facilitated and amplified and accelerated by the way technologies are being rolled out right now? And, universal basic income, we've known, as you advocated for more than anyone else, I think, is good. It's important, but there's a slew of other possibilities. We got to put them all on the table. Portable benefits, maybe workers having some levels of equity in app-based platforms, data.
Cooperative ownership arrangements. Sure. All right. So you're well ahead of the curve. You're writing papers, you wrote a book, and then at some point you hook up with the Bernie campaign. How does that come about?
Well,
Is that Ro Khanna? Ro Khanna reach out to you?
It was Representative Khanna I met because I used to do some hosting for the Young Turks, who are friends of mine. I tend to take a very sort of like conciliatory and positive sort of view, which maybe is not always the best for like woke media. It's a little annoying, to be honest. I'm more of a problem solver and a humanist.
Well, being a talking head definitely messes with your behaviors, because it's like, oh, get a load of this person, Ramesh, what do you think? And then you have to be like, oh, I mean, I've done it on CNN, and so I know the dynamic well.
Yeah, so it was Representative Khanna, and then it just happens. It's so cool. Like in our lives, you just randomly meet people, right? Like I met you through Ty, who works with you, and similarly, I knew Faz Shakir, who was Senator Sanders' campaign manager when he was working at the ACLU, because I was really interested in questions of surveillance and privacy in relation to hate against Asian peoples, Black peoples, etc., peoples of color in this country, and sort of surveillance issues with that. So I met Faz randomly. And I had a couple of friends, including my friend Jane Kim, who went to Stanford with me, was the head of the California for the Sanders campaign, which we won. Yep. And so it just felt like this was kind of like my world. It's very surreal to all of a sudden be in your mid 40s and to see like, hey, there's Andrew Yang.
Your buddies are running this stuff. Yeah.
Around my age, who's running for president, like this Buttigieg here. Like it's our time to take over and show compassionate leadership. So I just want to be of service to people I believe in, who can help make this world heal and make it more humane and democratic.
So you're working on the Bernie campaign, and do they come to you and are like, okay, what are the big policies we need to be pushing for technology? Because Bernie is aligned spiritually, but he doesn't understand tech. I mean, you don't begrudge him that. So what were the policies that you said, okay, here's what you should be integrating, and what was their response?
Well, my way of dealing with this is I had kind of written this like long document. I got to send it to you, called like a digital bill of rights. And it turned out that Ro Khanna was also voicing similar language, internet bill of rights. And his book just came out, which is great. I mean, I'm honored to be in the book, cited right before Jürgen Habermas, which was dope. So I was thinking about that. I was trying to send the people like at the, I wasn't like a prominent person in the campaign, but I was trying to send all these ideas to the people who were like policy directors in the campaign. Yep. I didn't get very far, man. I was a little like, okay. But at the same time, I was able to funnel some of those ideas to Representative Ocasio-Cortez, obviously to Representative Khanna. And also we worked on one policy together. I was kind of more in the surrogate role. In fact, one of my jobs was to, try to build bridges with Andrew Yang supporters in the campaign.
Good fun. I'm sure it worked pretty well, because the Andrew Yang supporters tend to like bridges. I hope.
We did work on one policy that I felt was really cool. It was called the Internet for All program. It was part of the Green New Deal. And what that would do would and I love this kind of stuff, it would incentivize, therefore creating jobs and spreading technological literacy. It would incentivize communities, in very rural locations and definitely Native American communities, to build and own their own ISPs, internet service provider kind of infrastructures, as well as mobile networks. And the reason why I think that's important is when we want to talk about connectivity to technology, it's not actually just simply an engineering question. It's not just connect or not. In the process of establishing connectivity, there are a number of interesting questions and possibilities for people to gain jobs. Like we've seen that in Detroit, right? Detroit like abandoned. Now there's amazing projects like the Detroit Community Technology Project. Lots of people are employed. Lots of digital literacy skills, which are critical in education, happened. So the Sanders campaign was attempting to do that. I had worked a lot with Native American communities when I was a PhD student and a little bit earlier in my time pre-tenure at UCLA. And so I was also thinking a lot about how do we set up tribal infrastructure. So one of the good things that happened with this infrastructure bill that got through is it did support, universal broadband. But it's not simply, when we use the term universal, do we mean Verizon doing the universality or AT&T doing the universality, or do we mean universality in the image of people being able to create their own solutions that work for them and their communities?
We all struggle sometimes, and it's particularly true in the winter. Sometimes you come back out of that funk, but sometimes you need some serious help. I mean, professional help. Now, getting professional help is easier than ever. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy, and I, for one, am super pumped to let people know about what BetterHelp can do for you. BetterHelp is online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Give it a try and see why over 2 million people have used BetterHelp Online Therapy. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and Forward listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/yang. That's BETTERHELP.com/yang. Get yourself some BetterHelp today. You'll be glad you did. So you referenced before that you were in Tahrir Square. What it made me think was that there was a point not that long ago, and you might not have been part of this chorus, but there was a sense that, hey, social media is going to make democracy flourish all over the place because it's very hard to maintain a repressive regime when everyone can have access to things and organize. And then people came together in the Arab Spring and toppled various governments, and we're like, wow, like democracy is going to bloom. And then that naivete essentially went poof, like puff of smoke, like in the weeks and months that followed, where in many ways authoritarianism benefited somehow. A lot of the technology-enabled dynamics did not improve things. Did you see that coming? Like, were you someone who was like, hey, this entire facile notion that more internet equals more democracy is not going to work out like people are hoping?
I called bullshit on that from the start. And the reason why is because there was a narrative that I consider neo-colonial, which is that our tools liberate you, right? And I knew fully well, and we know fully well, that, obviously this is great as a sort of branding campaign for Silicon Valley, but we knew even at that time that various types of quote unquote personalization algorithms were sending us into echo chambers, and these kinds of terms were known at the time, and some of my colleagues like Eli Pariser had done work on that subject. So the reason I went out there was I was super interested, A, in that narrative, and B, trying to actually not debunk it, but try to understand in a real way what contribution, if any, are these technology platforms having in this massive social movement, in this revolution. And what I quickly realized it's not technologies that contribute to social change, it's what people do with them that contributes to social change. So in Tahrir at that time, in Egypt at that time, about 5% or less like robust internet connectivity, 1% or so of social media connectivity. Those that were connected to those networks were more demographically homogenous, upper middle class, generally liberal, more educated. It turned out also the Ikhwan, or the Muslim Brotherhood, also had robust connectivity and were really the only organized form of resistance to the hegemony of the state. And then there was a very robust labor movement. So what I did is I pivoted around. I interviewed a lot of pretty radical Islamists, Ikhwan people. I can kind of blend in and out of things pretty easily. People super leftist, this and that. And I tried to look at what were their technological practices. And here's what I found out. People were realizing they could use social media to influence journalism. They could influence journalists by basically posting particular kinds of content on platforms and getting that content not just globalized in terms of having people like see what's going on around the world, but also influence people within their own country. Journalists in their own country are looking at what these people are posting on social media and remediating it, or what we call a media ecology, broadcasting it back onto satellite TV, because that's what everybody had at that time. And that was true in a lot of the Middle East and in India, where my family's from.
That's a fantastic feedback loop that they discovered. They're like, hey, you know what we can get? We can get media coverage.
Exactly. We can hustle this. So I was interviewing people like Ayman Moheldin. You might know him because he's now a MSNBC anchor, but he was like the man, Al Jazeera English out there. And I was looking at what Ayman was sourcing on Twitter, who he was following on Twitter, and he was strategically following certain kinds of activists who were putting stuff out. And here's the other cool thing that I saw: people were pulling things off of online media, like platforms like YouTube, and projecting it in public spaces. I saw that all around the country. So that had another kind of circulation of online, offline. And the reason why that was important was that could actually bring people together to look at some of the documentation of what was going on, some of which was manipulated content, by the way, very propagandist. And people would look at these things and they would just rile them up. So, of course, blind technological connectivity, in a sense, can disincentivize collective action, but certain forms of technological connectivity combined with the brilliance of activists who understand their own country, their own limitations, their own constraints, can make a huge change. And so that was really interesting to look at, because Occupy happened right after that. And I was also studying Occupy afterward.
Yeah, you were right there at the crux of history. It's wild. Around the same time, there was a similar naive belief that now we have seen fail, which is that the internet was going to connect us all to the sum total of human knowledge and thus make everyone smarter, more enlightened. There'd be new works of genius because you'd be able to access everything at your fingertips. Fast forward a number of years, and it feels like, if anything, we've gotten baser, dumber, more misinformed, more angry and inflamed. Is this also something that you kind of saw coming? I was with my friend Tristan Harris a couple of weeks ago, and he called it the race down the brainstem, because that's the way a lot of these social media platforms operate. Was this something that you were concerned about?
I've heard Tristan talk about that, and I've talked to him about that as well. Yeah, it is because of two major reasons. Well, first of all, on the kind of democratic global level, we never really had that global village, because not everyone from the globe was participating equally, not just with access, but also in content that was being put out. You know, Wikipedia at a certain point in time, and I love Wikipedia, 95% of its editors and primary authors were male and from the Western world, North America, Canada, Europe, and so on. So that speaks to how even an amazing, technology like Wikipedia is actually highly asymmetric in terms of who drives its content. But what we really saw was when this whole personalization thing came up, right? So the way Google functioned is it used an algorithm which we call PageRank, which basically said, if we're going to rank a bunch of Andrew Yangs with one another, we're going to pick the Andrew Yang that has the most backlinks linked to it. So it was based on domain-based knowledge. What the epistemological claim was, information that's most credible is most socially validated or socially linked to. So if you notice, none of that involves spying on people, right? None of that involved but then what happened is personalization became more about Googling us or socializing us on Facebook, right? Like, are we Googling or being Googled? Are we socializing or being socialized? Are we using technology or being used, right? There's a sort of dyadic relationship that is unexpressed and under discussed still to this day. So when they started doing this personalization stuff, what happened is we became Googled. And we became Googled not based on some sort of neutral notion of relevance, but based on what would grab our attention. And the way that works, which I think is really interesting, is it's all based on correlation. So, if you, Andrew Yang, have looked at, a million web pages, and I have all this data about your engagement on those different web pages, which we call documents in the information sciences, and then I have very similar profile to you, it will recommend content to me based on correlation mapping. It doesn't actually know what content is inflammatory or sensational, because we've never really done good AI work yet to that extent, I believe, in text mining. So I'm being nerdy here, but
please dig in. So, it can't tell whether it's inflammatory, but it can tell what I'm going to like. Is that a fair
precisely? And what is going to activate and maximize my attention? And we know through and through, and Tristan talks about this, that what maximizes that dopamine release and that cortisol release is outrageous content. We like to, we don't like to get outraged, but when we see the former...
But we do. We don't like to be outraged, but we kind of do.
We kind of do in this country. And the other really interesting point that I just want to make, again, slightly philosophical bent, is what's being fed to us online, which is, in our present world, and which will likely shape our future in many ways, is all based on the past. I think that's really important to point out, right? That our lives are being directed digitally based on past data, of which we know nothing about. We don't know what data is collected about us by whom, how it's being monetized, none of it. But imagine, right, Andrew, if your past is like over-determining of who you become, right? To me, that's a violation of humanism itself.
So what you're describing is why when you Google something and I Google something, we can get different results.
Even if we're demographically very similar, even if we're politically very similar, it's no longer about that. It's about the data body. That's the term we use in engineering. We call it a data body, which is sort of like, it's a triangulation of all these different kinds of data points, including data that might not even be gathered again by me on my phone or me intentionally. It might be data gathered about me when I'm walking right down the street and I see that Amazon vehicle right out there, because those all have surveillance cameras, external surveillance cameras.
Yeah, they can get us in the real world too every once in a while. Or we'll do something that says, hey, I used Apple Pay at this storefront. So it's like, oh, I know he was there. I know that there's like a buying pattern that starts developing. You opened by talking about the misuse of our data as one of the main things that you're concerned about. Were you in on the data rights legislation that was fashioned in California over the last several years? Because California really is at the forefront or the frontier. It's the only state I know of that has a data protection agency, which I jokingly refer to as like data cops. Like they should give them some kind of really cool uniform with some kind of futuristic badge, be like data cops here. And no other states come close to that. Were you consulted by the legislators who were drafting those rules?
Folks in the assembly have talked to me and a bunch of my other colleagues. We all gave input on that. I mean, and I actually have been talking to the New York State Assembly as well, where you are, Andrew. So about enacting something very similar.
Fantastic. I've been advocating for states just copying California. It's like, look, you don't know what's going on. Just take the California law and copy it word for word. Your people will be better off.
Yeah, I think it's pretty notable, right? Even though California is a hub for so many of these technology companies, that there's a sort of robust desire here also to try to balance things out as much as possible. And, Ro Khanna, right, is a congressman for much of Silicon Valley, right? Yet, and he manages to maintain, I really find it impressive, a really both conciliatory viewpoint, both in his affect and the way he speaks, but also, a recognition of the need for some significant changes.
I like Ro Khanna a great deal. I think he's on top of these issues in a way that virtually no other member of Congress is, maybe because he does represent Silicon Valley. He's also got the same kind of brain that you do or I do. It's like kind of this problem solving engineering brain.
Systemic. Yeah.
Yeah, not as easily inflamed. Or like, he's a very calm dude. So I started something called the Data Dividend Project that was trying to energize people around the fact that, hey, our data should be ours. They're making hundreds of billions of dollars a year off of it. It is a human issue, as you say. I do think that it erodes our autonomy or agency. It turns us into rats in a maze chasing these digital breadcrumbs that we don't even know about because someone's trying to make some money off of us. You have these quasi states in Google or Facebook. And this was my attempt to try to say to folks, we can do something about it. The Data Dividend Project does continue to do great work. The EU is ahead of us on this front, and I'm also helping out an EU effort around data unions that are easier to make happen in the EU because they have California type rules everywhere. And so they're going to end up being a step ahead of us. That all of that said, I don't have any illusions over the fact that right now I feel like we're losing this battle very, very badly. I haven't seen California's rules get enforced just yet against some of these mega tech companies, many of which are headquartered in the state. And some of the abuses and misuses of our data, I feel like, are getting more and more egregious all the time. I feel like I think most Americans can sense now when you're getting some random ads or text, you're like, hey, how the heck did they know that I was talking about going someplace warm or whatever it is? Like, it's getting spookier and spookier for a lot of people. If you were in charge, let's change patterns for a minute. Let's say that I had won the presidency. And so now I'm the president of the United States. And then we say, Ramesh, what should we do to try and fix the house? What would you recommend in terms of our data? Is it copy the EU type rules? Like what would you champion?
No, I mean, thank you for asking me that. I think, first of all, we need to curb certain practices like the retention of data. So, like, for example, first of all, there needs to be disclosure around who collects our data, who owns it, and how it's being monetized. One. Two, so that's what we call collection of data. Second is the retention of data. So, like, for example, should data about me when I was 18 years old still be made available to whomever? And, we don't even know who that is. So that's a huge issue because stuff from the past could be used to influence your future, like I discussed earlier. Third is data aggregation, right? I mean, people don't realize this, but anytime you use your credit card, you're releasing what we call a digital footprint. When you go to Rite Aid and have a Rite Aid card, that's where that data goes. That's why they try to incentivize you with discounts if you use their dumb card or whatever. So aggregation is a huge issue because this is exactly what shady organizations like Cambridge Analytica, who Steve Bannon was the VP of that company. Company was funded by Robert Mercer, who's a computational linguist with multiple patents from IBM. It speaks for itself, I mean, and they were bragging about how much data they had on 200 plus million Americans at the time of the election. The reason why that matters is not just because of the creepy way aggregation occurs, that I can have all this data. So basically, who I am at Rite Aid is probably different than who I am on Instagram, which is also different than who I am in another aspect of my life. And part of the power of being human is we get to have our own identity be directed by ourselves in different contexts, right? Like, when I'm in front of my students, I don't want them to know what my dating life might be like or something like that, right? It's like different parts of our lives, but they're all being aggregated. And someone like Cambridge Analytica, I think it's useful that example is brought up because they claimed with all that data, they could establish psychographic models of human identity. So it's not that, Andrew, you're Asian American, or Ramesh, you're Asian American. It's that you're neurotic around your kids at this time in the morning. They're mapping you as a psychological subject, not in a stable way, but it's like Ramesh is open in this way, conscientious in this way, extroverted in this way. It's called the Ocean model. And it's a complex model of identity. So these are all things that on the level of data and data transactions, they have to be dealt with. But the externalities of this digital economy, meaning the effects that are not simply about our screens or these moments we're online, are the real issues, right? The fact that massive income and wealth inequalities are all being shifted to those who control the drawstrings of technology. Look at the doubling of wealth amongst the 10 wealthiest people in the world, many of whom are tech people, right? Bezos, Musk, etc., right? Zuckerberg. During this pandemic, we are more technologically dependent than ever before. So all of those sort of pipes are being invisibly monetized and redirected away from us. So we have to deal with digital economy issues. I think we need to identify jobs of the future now. We need to change our educational system so they can work with those jobs, though, as we know well, education shouldn't just be about training people for jobs, kind of unlike what my parents had told me back in the day a little bit. It's also about what does it mean to be human, right? And that's why the humanities and the arts are more important than ever before. So economic interventions, data-related interventions, and interventions on the level of education.
It sounds like you're advocating a national digital bill of rights that includes ownership of our own data and certainly knowledge of who the heck is doing what where our data is concerned. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And one last component that's important is involving stakeholders in the design of various algorithms. So predictive policing algorithms, if they should exist at all, I don't really want them to exist, or facial recognition systems. Groups like Black Lives Matter should be involved in the design of those systems and the audit of those systems, because we know that many of those AI and algorithmic systems have turned out to be racially or gender biased or definitely geographically biased. So that's because, again, not because the people building them are racist or discriminatory.
Yeah, it's just the data. You put data into it, and then it's just going to end up. It's the same thing on the jobs front too.
Yep. I've been reading a lot about machine learning algorithms being used to replace human resources work and how they've been kind of having these biases too. So we got to introduce new jobs of the future. We got to transition full on to this digitally mediated economy right away, which is, digitally mediated economy doesn't just mean screens. It means automated systems replacing Amazon workers whose data is being tracked about all the time, right? So if Amazon is one of our main employers in this country, quite likely that many of those jobs will be obsolescent. So we got to figure out what the new jobs are going to be as a result. So I have colleagues, some of them, Tim Wu and others, who are thinking about these issues as well.
Oh yeah, let's talk about Tim. So to the extent the Biden administration has a man on the inside that thinks the same way you and I do, it is Tim Wu. Wrote very, very influential books on data, like Master Switch and some others. Brilliant guy. He's a very, very senior Biden official who's meant to be reining in some of these tech companies. So I'm very, very eager in terms of figuring out what he can get done, because it's the equivalent in my mind of like having you there, because Tim thinks, I imagine he and you see eye to eye on, I'm guessing, 90% of things. So what the heck is Tim going to be able to produce from that perch? Because it's not like he has a junior role. He has a pretty senior role. Am I right?
Yes, he does. And, and also the Federal Trade Commission has Lina Khan, who's his colleague at Columbia Law School, who's a big antitrust person. Apparently Amazon has kind of petitioned or sent notes saying want to be recused from any sort of activity or action. Not sure where that went. I was sort of reading up on that. I think that, there is a space for some sort of action to occur from Tim and his colleagues. I haven't really been in touch or talked to them much. I'm not sure they're even allowed to talk with us, right?
I'm not sure if they're allowed to talk to us, Ramesh, but I'm also not sure what we're waiting on. Like, what are they going to announce that's going to make it happen? I know there was some stuff where, like, okay, some of the tech companies are a little concerned that antitrust is going to be enforced differently because of Lina. I was on the debate stage saying, look, the antitrust rules don't make any sense in an age of dominant technology companies. A lot of these markets just flow towards one winner. And so if you go and say, let's break them up and compete, you're like, well, kind of, but that's not really going to do the trick. And like, you're going to end up just replacing one winner take all dynamic with probably like multiple winner take all dynamics in slightly different categories. Like, it's just the nature of the thing. And what I said on stage was like, look, no one's binging anything because no one wants to use the third best search engine because all of the data is going to go to number one.
Google's a natural monopoly. Facebook and its products, certainly like an Instagram, WhatsApp, right, both owned by Facebook, Meta, etc., are
Yeah, no one wants to be on a social media platform that no one else is on. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
That's right. It's what we call network effects. There's no point of being on other platforms when no one else is on there. So they might be better understood as what we could call natural monopolies. You as a lawyer know about this.
Yeah, and so saying like we're going to have them compete doesn't make sense. So really what you need to do is get into the guts and figure out, okay, what are the problems we're concerned about with this particular natural monopoly?
A utility-based regulatory model is what my colleague Deepayan Ghosh and I have been calling for. We published a piece in the Journal of Democracy about why we may want to look at these things as utilities now, these things being these tech companies and their platforms. And what if we were to look at them as sort of public utilities, recognizing, right, and we spoke about this before, that every one of these tech companies would be valueless without an internet that I guess originally, 1969, we all paid for as American taxpayers. Neither of us were alive then, but that started at Boulter Hall at UCLA, right? So again, just like the roads that Amazon monetizes for its delivery vehicles are paid for by us, there has to be a public-private kind of balance in relation to this. So we use a utility-based model, recognizing that these things have to have certain kind of public utility to them and kind of set our threshold definitions accordingly. You can legislate accordingly. And I also think just one quick thing that I think is interesting is how there's bipartisan and generally American people, and you know this with Forward Party, like we agree on almost everything. I mean,
most priorities we agree on. Yeah,
we just need to implement those things. I mean, I know that's what you're trying to do. It's like,
yeah,
God help us. Let's just do those things. And one thing that Americans agree on, and a lot of our elected representatives, is that the status quo with big tech isn't good. I mean, and Republicans claim because of free speech issues. I mean, whatever. Okay, sure. I don't quite know if I agree with that, but and us progressives like myself, I think because I'm very concerned with the ways it's partitioning and creating imbalances in power politically and economically. And that's what.
Yeah, I call it the splintering of the American consciousness. I think that's the problem that you can get everyone to agree on. Maybe if you can get everyone to agree on anything. I mean, that it's kind of circular where it's like the reason we can't agree on anything is because our consciousness has been splintered by the social media companies.
Political parties are internally corrupted.
Yeah, that's another problem is you have two corrupt parties in a corrupt system, and then each of them's like, well, you think we're corrupt, check out the other side. And then there are a lot of people that are like, oh yeah, I really don't like that other side. And then if you come up and say like, hey, maybe the lesser of two evils thing is not really the way to go, maybe we should introduce a more dynamic, resilient, sustainable system. And then everyone's like, no, can't do that because they're so programmed. It's a very strange thing. It's actually not that strange. In some ways, it's predictable. But every time I run into things like this, it's like another reminder. So there are proponents of Web3 technologies that believe that it can do away with some of the worst of the abuses you're describing, because instead of a giant tech company making a bunch of choices, you can have those choices be distributed among like a decentralized autonomous organization that makes decisions based upon different actors. You can have a distributed ledger so that instead of having a big tech company saying, hey, we affirm these transactions, or like, this is kosher, it'd be like, well, actually, I don't really need you to do that because we can all just see it for ourselves if we felt like it. So there are people that are extraordinarily excited about the potential of this next generation of the internet. Another group will say like, hey, you're going to wind up with Facebook/metaverse overrunning the thing in its usual fashion. It's going to invest, I think I saw something like, $10+ billion a year on this thing, and make it so that it's Zuck's kind of Disney World.
Truman Show. Remember that?
Yeah, Truman Show. Where are you in terms of your enthusiasm and excitement level for the vision and the hopes that some people have for Web3?
Well, I think one thing I want to say about kind of cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technologies, which you are very in that world, is I think it is somewhat sad that trust can only be established in, think about the claim that we can only trust one another when we are using a technology that kind of guarantees trust, because it assumes that no one is trustworthy, right? I mean, just sort of as a claim, right? I think that the idea of technologies that can be truly peer-to-peer, as the internet was sort of prophesized to be and was definitely in its early stages, is really important. I think that it can allow a lot of corrupt third parties, including those platform providers, to be bypassed. But also, like, for example, imagine in a country like Ghana, which I wrote about in my last book, in Beyond the Valley, you can actually do peer-to-peer, like things on like land titles, for example, instead of going through corrupt, feudalists, etc. Right? So these issues can be very global in their scale, and they can be really peer-to-peer. The aspect of it that I really feel is sorely missing is the community aspect of it, right? And I really, really want everybody to remember, first of all, this is a long time ago, but there was no commerce permitted on the internet, I believe, until like 1998 or 1999, something like that. First of all,
no commerce allowed.
No commerce allowed. I mean, I'm not saying that's what we want, but I just want us to remember that was only like 24 years ago or whatever. I know it's a long time.
I vaguely remember the internet of those days. Remember, it was slow and clunky, but it also had kind of a purity to it. It was like a lot of message boards.
I want to ask the question of, if we were to transform the internet into something that's more communitarian, where we all use this or engage with this as a way to also believe in one another, work with one another, trust one another, what might that look like as a design experiment, right? Like that, does that mean we sort of give people equity, in platforms, like even partial equity? Does that mean that, this internet is associated with universal jobs, right? That's the question I'm very interested in. Or if we want to think about digital currencies, should they be state and fiat based, right? Otherwise, they're going to have so much volatility with them, as we've seen, and become modes of speculative investment, right? I appreciate the rollout of Web3 and crypto stuff as a certain kind of response to this problematic, troubling situation that we can all agree on. But I'm curious if there is another shoe to drop that can be more about a union, more about all of us coming together. That is really, that larger question is the question that motivates everything I care about. People coming together in respect and compassion and trust and support, right? Across our differences. And I know I sound like a total like civil rights hippie person here, but it's
no, really you sound like a real visionary and optimist, even more so than me. And
like inside than me, right? I mean, you've been in political campaigns.
Well, so here's where you and I differ in some ways, Ramesh. I mean, I think you and I agree on most everything, and the way we differ is that I look at what's happening in some of these environments and I'm like, whoa, that's like really troubling, very, very nasty. I have a sense as to how we can make things better, as you do. But I feel like you fast forward to the way the world should be even more so than I do. Like you take it like a step further, whereas maybe because I'm so exposed to the reality, I'm like, how do we make this less terrible?
Yeah.
I mean, you can envision the ideal more naturally than I can.
This is honestly, total privilege of being in a university and getting to be a real free thinker and to imagine. And
yes, you're a free thinker. You're like unbound by some of the very market-based realities that I witness.
Yeah, and the other, I'll just say the one other issue or theme that's so important for me is the care of our planet. Again.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Here, but like, remember, Bitcoin mining, electronic waste with planned obsolescence in these Apple phones. Are they really any different than Monsanto seeds? I'm not trying to gaslight, but like, it's kind of the same logic, right?
Well, I think most people would disagree with planned technological obsolescence, and certainly one of the painful things about Bitcoin mining is this incredible energy consumption associated with it. It's one reason why, there are some other cryptocurrencies that don't have that kind of environmental impact, which is something I applaud.
I've been trying to push right to repair legislation. I've worked with a couple like state assemblies in Michigan and other places to try to get that to happen. One of the coolest things I've seen all around the world, Andrew, is I have seen how in places like Kenya and Nairobi, I've seen it in Mexico City, I've seen it in India, I've seen it right here in LA, especially like kind of toward the south part of downtown where it's more like barrio, people are repairing everything, recycling everything. Everything is being kind of combined. And what I've seen in like Nairobi or in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia is people taking transistors out of like old computers and kind of remixing it MacGyver style with like, with digital electronics. And so I just think that there are these kind of secondary and tertiary informal economies that are really important to recognize that are sort of the offshoot of this digital world, and they've existed, of course, in the industrial context as well. But I think that again, the more we can kind of facilitate policies and give voice and inspiration to the creativity of people. So here's why I'm an optimist. I really do believe in the creativity and in a lot of ways the goodness of people, and I've seen it. And I really think that most people are like that, and I saw you tweet something like that, like yesterday, like there's good people everywhere, something like that,
Yeah. And I agree with you, one, on the power of creativity, and two, on the need to build communities in multiple ways, which I would suggest includes offline as well as online. I mean, I accept that we're going to be doing a ton online, but I do think that there's something very intrinsic and human about people getting together and forming bonds and connections face to face. I'm also invigorated by some of the things that I see that are a little bit less conspicuous. I mean, one of the dark things about the present time is that if you go onto social media, like you can get exposed to some very, very terrible things very quickly, and you're like, oh, like this isn't that good. It's one reason why I try to keep my stuff really positive, because I feel like there's negativity in a lot of other places.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and remember also like that world that's being fed to us via social media is likely to computationally select, algorithmically select content that
Yep.
will rile us up. I've been trolled online, not probably nearly to the extent that you have, but I've done it. I've had a lot of that come my way. And then this is a very personal thing, but I've developed a lot of practices where I can just sort of like, I'm a Buddhist, so I can just sort of like sit with things and look at them and see like, is this really real? Is this really affecting me? And how do I want to engage with it, right? And in a sense, remember the logic, the computational logic and cadence to these technologies are always on, multi-channel, multitasking, and they're overwhelming and disorienting. I mean, this is literally what Neil Stephenson wrote about in his description of the metaverse in his book Snow Crash, right? From like,
I remember Snow Crash, hero protagonist. What a book.
I loved that book. I loved William Gibson and him. And I used to read all that stuff. And it was like, like Blade Runner style a little bit. And then,
yeah, Neuromancer, those books, wow, were they groundbreaking at the time. Like you read them, and most of what they predicted came true in some form.
Yeah, sci-fi is very helpful as a text. So it's like, again, remembering like what does it mean to be human? How do we want to live as human beings? And one thing I'm really thinking about and writing about, I might write a new book that is philosophy based.
Well, you should write a new book, period, but continue.
Okay, yeah, please. I would love your advice on that. Is about borders and bordering, right? So like biometric technologies border us because they partition us into data bodies, right? Meaning technologies that are gathering physiognomic input, right? Or physiological input. Space now has become this new border for those who have and those who have not. Notably interesting how those who are the most wealthy in the history of the world are so obsessed with space, right? That to me speaks to a certain kind of fatalism and negativity about our planet and its people, right? And really generally when we want to think about knowledge itself and different cultures in the world, this idea of borders is not as sort of cutthroat, right? In the world, who gets to move in the world and who doesn't, right? Like, why are sub-Saharan African immigrants drowning in the Mediterranean, or the way things are in our border here? So you might think, like, why is Ramesh talking about all this? I'm really interested in thinking about that in this digitally mediated world, right? Like, so if we are to think about technologies again, that where borders are more about people communicating with one another and negotiating relationships rather than this. So I really want, anyone and everyone who's listening to this to work with me on this. Like, I really want, so like, it's not just about reforming or, oh, we got to deal with this problem or that problem, little things here and there, kind of like the way our political system works, this kind of anxiety driven political system we have. But I want imagination and transformation also to be part of our blueprint.
Amen. That's glorious, Ramesh. How can people find you and keep up with you?
So I'm on Twitter. I'm not so active on social media for my own like personal mental health, but on Twitter I'm Ramesh Media, RAMESHMEDIA. I'm hoping that I can get onto other podcasts, some of the ones you mentioned to me when we talked before, Andrew, that I can keep sharing these ideas and these visions. People can take a look at my book, which I wrote as a crossover book. I wrote it with MIT Press, but I really tried to write it like a journalist. That was a great exercise for me. It's called
Beyond the Valley.
Yeah, and that was a real honor to write. I wrote a little about you and about the dividend programs and universal basic income in there. I talked to Michael Tubbs, who had been running those UBI experiments.
Great guy.
And yeah, I met Mike like almost 15 years ago at a TED conference, and he was like 22 or something. And it's and I think more than anything, I just want people to know, like, I'm like inspired and excited. And so, I'm not like some kind of elite who won't.
He's really not, people. Ramesh is a beautiful human being and a true positive visionary. So Godspeed, Ramesh. You and I will just keep on fighting for a brighter future. And with someone like you, helping show us what it can look like, we have a much better shot at getting there.
I hope so. We're all in it together. That's the thing we got to remember. We're actually all in it together, right? Hasn't the pandemic shown?
We are all in it together.
We're all in it together, and we gotta
come together and pull together and try and get some real solutions across the table.
We sure as hell can do it, though. We sure as hell.
Amen. Let's go. Thank you so much, Ramesh.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure and privilege.
Thank you for having me.